You'd think a man who lives alone on a mountain for 5 years would get used to the silence. But Samuel Hawkins knew the truth. Silence is never silent. It's filled with the ghosts of sounds. The whisper of wind through pines sounds like a woman's sigh. The creak of a frozen branch sounds like a floorboard in a distant farmhouse. The thump of your own heart sounds like a fist on a coffin lid. For 5 years, Samuel had learned to ignore these ghosts. He worked until his muscles screamed louder than the memories. He chopped wood from sunup to sundown, the clean bite of the axe a kind of prayer. Thwack, thwack, thwack. One swing for the wife he'd lost, one for the daughter he'd buried, one for the man he used to be. The cabin was his tomb, a one-room box of mud and logs he'd built to keep the world out, or maybe to keep what was left of him in. Inside, everything had its place. The rope bed, the rough-hewn table, the single chair. On the mantel above the stone fireplace sat a small, tarnished photograph frame. It had been turned face down 5 years ago, and he had never turned it back. He was just sitting down to his usual meal, beans, same as yesterday, same as tomorrow, when the storm hit. It wasn't a gentle snow. It was a fist of wind and ice that slammed into the mountain, screaming like a wounded animal. Samuel barely noticed. Storms were just another kind of silence. He banked the fire, barred the door, and lay down on his cot, fully clothed. The wind howled. The cabin groaned. He closed his eyes, ready for another night of empty, dreamless sleep. But tonight, the storm brought something with it. A sound that didn't belong. He sat bolt upright, every nerve on fire. It was high and thin, woven through the gale like a thread of sorrow. A cry. He told himself it was the wind. A mountain cat. A trick of his lonely mind. He'd heard stories of trappers going mad from the solitude, hearing voices in the trees. But then it came again, clearer this time. A single word carried on the wind. Papa! Samuel's blood ran cold. It was a ghost. It had to be. It was her voice. His Mary. The daughter he'd held in his arms as a fever stole her last breath. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms against his ears. Go away. You're not real. He stayed like that for what felt like an hour, a statue of grief, while the storm raged. The voice didn't come again. See? Just the wind. Just his mind, finally cracking after all this time. He was about to lie back down when a different sound ripped through the night. It wasn't a ghostly whisper this time. It was a raw, terrified scream. The sound of a living person in mortal danger. Samuel was on his feet before he even realized he'd moved. The ghost voice might have been a trick of his mind. But that scream, that was real. Someone was out there. Someone was being hunted. He stood frozen, his hand on the heavy bar across the door. 5 years. 5 years he'd kept this door barred. 5 years he'd sworn off humanity. People meant pain. Connection meant loss. Opening that door meant breaking the only promise he'd ever kept to himself. The wind tore at the cabin, and through it he heard another sound. A child sobbing in terror. He didn't have a choice. He never really did. Samuel threw the bar aside and wrenched the door open. The blizzard punched him in the face, a wall of white fury. He grabbed his lantern, pulled on his heavy coat, and stepped out into the storm, plunging into a world where the living and the dead were screaming his name. He had no idea that by opening that door, he hadn't just let the storm in. He had opened a doorway to a past he thought he'd buried, and invited in a danger far colder and more deadly than any winter night. The wind was a physical force trying to shove him back into the cabin, to scour the breath from his lungs. The lantern cast a pathetic, flickering circle of light that was immediately swallowed by the swirling chaos. Snow bit at his exposed skin like tiny needles of ice. "Hello!" he roared, the wind snatching the word from his lips and flinging it into the void. He followed the edge of the clearing, wading through snow that was already up to his thighs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. This was suicide. Chasing voices in a blizzard. He'd freeze to death in 20 minutes. But the sound of that child sobbing was burned into his mind. It was the sound of his own failure, a 5-year-old echo he couldn't ignore. He was about to give up, to retreat to his tomb, when the lantern light caught something. A dark shape huddled at the base of a fallen pine, almost completely buried by a fresh drift of snow. He scrambled over, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It wasn't one shape. It was three. Three small figures, clinging to each other for warmth, so covered in snow they looked like frozen statues. He brushed the snow away from the first one, a girl maybe 17 or 18, her face pale as marble, her lips tinged with blue. He touched her cheek. Ice, but her eyelids fluttered. Alive. The other two were younger, huddled beneath her like chicks under a hen's wing. He found them all one by one, faint pulses of life in the frozen darkness. No time for questions, no time for anything but action. He scooped up the smallest one, a girl of maybe 8 or 9, shocked at how little she weighed. She was a feather in his arms. He turned to the other two. "Get up!" he bellowed, using a voice he hadn't used since the war. "On your feet! You stay here! You die!" The oldest girl's eyes blinked open, unfocused. She tried to push herself up, pulling the middle sister with her. They swayed like saplings in the gale, but they stood. "Follow me," he ordered, his words clipped and harsh. "Don't stop." The journey back to the cabin was a 50-yard lifetime. The wind fought them for every inch. The girls fell. He hauled them up. The child in his arms grew heavier, her life a flickering candle he was trying to shield from a hurricane. Finally, the dim light of the cabin doorway appeared through the swirling snow. He kicked the door open, shoved the girls inside, and slammed it shut, sealing them in the screaming storm out. They collapsed in a heap on the floor, a tangle of frozen limbs and snow-caked clothes. He laid the little one on his bed and immediately went to work, his movements economical and practiced. He stripped off their frozen, wet garments. No time for modesty. Death was in the room, and he had to fight it. He wrapped them in every blanket he owned, piling them near the hearth as he stoked the fire until it roared like a dragon. The cabin filled with a suffocating warmth. The girls shivered violently, their teeth chattering. The youngest still hadn't stirred. The middle one was coughing, a deep rattling sound that worried him. The oldest one, the one who seemed to be in charge, finally pushed herself up on one elbow. She looked around the sparse cabin, her eyes wide with a fear that went deeper than just the cold. She wasn't looking at the fire or the blankets. She was looking at him. Her lips moved, raw and cracked. She tried to speak. He knelt beside her, offering a cup of warm water from the kettle. "You're safe now," he said, the words feeling foreign and untrue in his mouth. She took the cup, her hands shaking. She looked past him, at the barred door, at the rifle propped against the wall. The fear in her eyes sharpened into something else. Suspicion, terror. Her gaze snapped back to his face. Her first words weren't, "Thank you." They weren't, "Where are we?" They were a choked, terrified whisper. "Did he send you?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence he was used to. "He?" Samuel stared at her. The girl, her name he'd learned was Ruth, seemed to realize her mistake immediately. A mask of caution slammed down over her features, but it was too late. He'd seen the raw terror in her eyes. These girls weren't just lost. They weren't just caught in a storm. They were running from someone. "Who?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "No one. I'm confused." She was lying. It was as plain as the bruises he could now see peeking out from the collar of her worn dress. He didn't press. Not yet. The most immediate threat was the cold. The middle girl, Emma, was burning with fever, her breathing shallow and ragged. The little one, Rose, was still unconscious, her skin a waxy, unnatural white. For the next few hours, he was no longer a hermit. He was a field medic, a nurse, a guardian. He forced warm broth between their lips. He rubbed their frozen hands and feet, fighting to bring life back to their extremities. He brewed a tea from willow bark for Emma's fever, an old remedy his wife had sworn by. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Catherine, her hands smelling of herbs, her face etched with worry as she tended to a sick Mary. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. Emotion was a luxury. Survival was the only currency that mattered right now. Slowly, life returned to the cabin. Rose finally woke, her blue eyes wide and lost. Emma's shivering subsided into a feverish stillness. And Ruth. Ruth watched his every move, wary as a cornered wolf. "Our wagon broke down," she said finally, her voice stronger. "On the old pass. Our parents. They went for help. Told us to stay put." It was a good story, plausible, except for a few details. The pass she mentioned had been impassable for weeks. Their clothes, though torn and dirty, were made of fine wool, not the rough homespun of settlers. And then there was the fear, the kind of bone-deep terror that doesn't come from being lost in a storm. Later that night, as the girls slept fitfully in his bed, a single tangled heap of exhaustion, Samuel couldn't rest. Ruth's question echoed in his mind. "Did he send you?" He needed answers. He pulled on his coat and slipped back, out into the dying storm. The wind had lessened and the snow had stopped. The moon was a ghostly smudge behind the clouds. He went back to the fallen pine where he'd found them, the lantern held high. He wasn't looking for a broken wagon. He was looking for tracks. He found the girl's small footprints, already half erased by the wind. But a few yards away, he found something else. Hoofprints, a single horse ridden hard, and beside them the deep impressions of a man's heavy boots. The tracks told a clear story. The horse had stopped here. The man had dismounted. There were signs of a struggle in the snow, a frantic, scuffed-up area. The girls had run. He had chased them. Then Samuel saw the most chilling detail of all. The man's boot prints and the horse's tracks led away from the spot. They pointed back down the mountain. The man hadn't gotten lost. He hadn't gone for help. He had given up the chase. He had left 3 little girls to die in a blizzard. Samuel stood there in the frozen silence of the forest, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. He finally understood. This wasn't the end of their ordeal. The man who was hunting them was still out there, and leaving them for dead meant one of 2 things. Either he was sure the storm would kill them, or he was planning to come back to make sure the job was done. The cabin, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The storm had trapped them all inside, 4 souls in a space built for one. For the next 3 days, as the snow piled up past the windows, a strange, tense domesticity took hold. Emma's fever broke, leaving her weak and quiet, her dark eyes following Samuel everywhere. Rose, with the resilience of a child, seemed to recover the quickest, though she clung to her older sister's side. And Ruth was a storm cloud of anxiety, pacing the small space, jumping at every creak of the logs. She kept up the lie about their parents, but the story grew thinner with every passing hour. Samuel would catch them whispering, their heads close together, falling silent the moment he entered the room. They were hiding something big. On the 3rd day, he was cleaning his rifle by the fire, a nervous habit he'd picked up in the war, when Rose, the youngest, approached him. She was holding something in her small chapped hand. "Mister," she said, her voice a tiny whisper, "is this yours?" She opened her palm. Lying in it was a man's cufflink. It was heavy, made of silver, with a polished black stone set in the center. It was expensive, the kind of thing no homesteader or trapper would ever own. "Found it in my pocket," she said. "Don't know how it got there." Samuel took the cufflink. It was cold and heavy, like a secret. He looked at Ruth. Her face had gone pale. "Where did you get this?" Samuel asked, his voice flat. Ruth rushed over, snatching the cufflink from his hand. "It's nothing. A trinket. It belonged to our father." "Your father, the settler?" Samuel asked, his gaze unwavering. "The one whose wagon broke down on the pass?" The lie finally shattered. Ruth's composure broke, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "There was no wagon," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "We were running." "From who?" She hesitated, looking at her sleeping sisters. "Our uncle," she whispered. "Our parents. They died of a fever last fall. Our uncle was supposed to take care of us. But he was cruel. He wanted to send us to an orphanage. So we ran." It was another good story. Closer to the truth, he suspected, but still not the whole of it. It didn't explain the cufflink or the sheer terror he'd seen in her eyes that first night. It didn't explain why a man would hunt them down on horseback only to leave them for dead. But it was enough for now. The immediate problem was more pressing. Their food was running out. His carefully rationed winter supplies, meant for one, were dwindling fast with 4 mouths to feed. "I have to go to town," he announced the next morning, "to Millbrook, for supplies." Ruth's head snapped up. "No, you can't leave us. We're out of flour and salt pork. We'll starve if I don't." He looked at them, his face grim. "I'll bar the door from the outside. Don't open it for anyone. Don't make a sound. I'll be back by nightfall." The trip to Millbrook was a journey into a world he had abandoned. The snow was deep and he had to break trail the whole way. It took him hours. The town was just a handful of buildings huddled in a valley, a place he visited twice a year and left as quickly as possible. Old Jonas, the storekeeper, raised a bushy eyebrow when Samuel loaded up on flour, bacon, coffee, and even some horehound candy. "Expecting company, Samuel?" Jonas asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Bear got into my stores," Samuel lied, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. Jonas just grunted, not believing him for a second, but not pressing the issue. Mountain folk respected a man's privacy. As Samuel was loading the supplies onto his sled, his eyes caught a piece of paper nailed to the post outside the store. It was a handbill, fresh and new. His blood turned to ice. It was a missing persons notice. The sketches were crude, but unmistakable. Ruth, Emma, and Rose. It described them as runaways, wards of their loving stepfather, Mr. Marcus Walsh. It offered a substantial reward for their safe return. Samuel's hands tightened on the sled rope. Stepfather, not an uncle. Another lie. He was about to turn away when Jonas stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his apron. "Shame about those girls, ain't it?" Jonas said, nodding toward the poster. "Their stepfather passed through here a few days back, right before the storm hit. Man named Walsh." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He forced himself to stay calm, to just nod. Jonas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Funny thing, though, for a man so worried about his lost girls, he seemed more like a bounty hunter looking for lost property. Asked a lot of questions about who lived up on the mountain." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Walsh had been here. He knew Samuel's cabin existed. He knew someone lived up here. And Samuel was leading him right to them. He had to get back. Now. The journey back up the mountain was a frantic, desperate race against time in the setting sun. Every shadow looked like a man lying in wait. Every snap of a twig sounded like a cocking hammer. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning in the frigid air, the storekeeper's words ringing in his ears. He seemed more like a bounty hunter. He half expected to find the cabin empty, or worse. The image of what a man like that could do to 3 defenseless girls drove him onward, a cold dread coiling in his gut. When he finally burst into the clearing, the cabin was dark and silent, smoke curling peacefully from the chimney. For a terrifying second, he thought he was too late. He fumbled with the bar, his hands clumsy with cold and fear, and threw the door open. 3 faces turned toward him, pale and frightened in the firelight. They were safe. The wave of relief that washed over him was so powerful, it almost brought him to his knees. He slammed the door shut, barring it behind him, and leaned against it, breathing heavily. "What is it?" Ruth asked, her voice trembling. "What's wrong?" Samuel didn't answer. He walked over to the table, threw the sack of supplies down, and pulled the crumpled handbill from his pocket. He smoothed it out and placed it in the center of the table. "Who is Marcus Walsh?" he demanded. The girls stared at the poster, at the crude drawings of their own faces, at the name of the man who haunted their nightmares. Emma let out a small whimper and buried her face in Ruth's side. Rose just stared, her eyes wide and blank with shock. Ruth looked up at him, her face a mask of despair. The lies were over. There was nowhere left to run. "He's our stepfather," she said, her voice hollow. And then the whole ugly story poured out of her. Their mother, a widow, had married Walsh 2 years ago, hoping for security. At first he'd been charming, but the charm had quickly worn off, replaced by a cruel temper fueled by whiskey. The beatings started, the threats. After their mother died of a sudden sickness the previous spring, Walsh's cruelty had escalated. He saw the girls not as daughters but as property, assets, and he had found a buyer. "His name is Garrett," Ruth whispered, her voice shaking with revulsion. He owns the saloon in the town we came from. He, he'd been watching me. And Walsh owed him money. A lot of money from gambling. She didn't need to say the rest. Samuel understood. Walsh hadn't just been cruel. He'd sold his stepdaughter into a life that was a fate worse than death. The night before I was supposed to be handed over, Ruth continued, we ran. We took what little money Mother had saved and we just ran. The cabin was silent save for the crackling of the fire and Emma's muffled sobs. Samuel looked from the poster to the three terrified faces in front of him. He finally understood the hoof prints, the chase, the reason Walsh had left them to die. If they froze to death on the mountain, they couldn't talk. They couldn't expose him. You're going to turn us in, aren't you? Ruth asked, her voice laced with a bitter certainty. For the reward. You're just like them. The accusation struck him harder than a physical blow. He looked at these children, broken and hunted, and saw a reflection of his own failure. He'd failed to protect his own family from the randomness of fate. How could he protect these girls from the deliberate cruelty of men? Without a word, he walked to the mantel. His hand trembled as he reached for the downturned photograph frame. He picked it up, the cold metal a familiar weight in his palm. For 5 years, this picture had been a closed door to his past. Now he opened it. He turned it around and placed it back on the mantel, facing out into the room. The image showed a smiling woman with kind eyes, her arm around a small, pigtailed girl who was missing her 2 front teeth. His Catherine, his Mary. Their names were Catherine and Mary, he said, his voice thick with 5 years of unshed grief. They were my wife and daughter. A fever took them both in 3 days. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't save them. He turned to face the girls, his face a granite mask of pain. I don't save people, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Everyone I care about dies. So no, I'm not turning you in. But don't you mistake that for kindness. I'm not your savior. This cabin isn't a sanctuary. It's just a place to wait for the end. It was the cruelest thing he could have said, a warning meant to push them away, to protect his frozen heart from the pain of caring. But before anyone could respond, before the weight of his confession could settle over the room, a sharp, sudden sound cut through the tension. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud. It was a polite, almost gentle rapping of knuckles on wood. But in the charged silence of the cabin, it sounded like a hammer blow of fate. They all froze. Walsh. It had to be. He'd found them. Samuel grabbed his rifle, motioning for the girls to hide behind the bed. His mind raced. One man against how many? Walsh had been asking questions in town. He wouldn't have come alone. Who is it? He called out, his voice a low growl. Just a traveler, friend, a cheerful voice called back. Name's Elias, trapper. Got caught in this squall. Just looking for a warm fire to wait it out. A trapper? It was possible. Mountain folk sometimes sought shelter during sudden storms, but the timing was too perfect. It was a trap. Samuel moved to the small grime-covered window, trying to peer outside. He could make out the shape of a single man, hunched against the wind, a pack on his back. He seemed to be alone. Go away, Samuel shouted. No room here. Please, friend, the man called back, his voice pleading. My fingers are near frozen. I'll be on my way at first light. I have my own rations. I won't be any trouble. Ruth looked at him, her eyes wide with panic. It could be a trick, a scout sent to see if they were here. But what if he was just a trapper? Could they let a man freeze to death on their doorstep? Samuel made a decision. It was better to have the potential enemy inside where he could see him than outside where he couldn't. All right, he yelled. Come in, but slowly. He unbarred the door, holding the rifle ready. The man who stumbled in was small and wiry, with a cheerful, round face and a thick beard frosted with ice. He looked harmless. He smiled gratefully, rubbing his hands together as he moved toward the fire. Mighty grateful to you, friend. Elias Pike, at your service, he said, unstrapping his pack. Nasty weather to be caught out in. Samuel just grunted, not lowering the rifle. State your business. Just checking my trap lines. Got turned around when the snow picked up. Lucky I saw your smoke. He warmed his hands by the fire, chatting amiably about the price of beaver pelts and the harshness of the winter. He seemed genuine. Samuel started to relax just a little. He offered the man a cup of coffee, which Elias accepted with a grateful sigh. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the wind outside and the crackle of the fire. Then the trapper spoke again, his tone casual. "Funny thing," Elias said, sipping his coffee. "Ran into a posse a few miles down the mountain. A dozen men, maybe more. Well armed. Said they were hunting a band of fugitives." Samuel's blood ran cold. A dozen men. "They were led by a hard-looking fella," Elias continued, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Man named Walsh. He offered me good money to keep an eye out. Said his girls had been kidnapped. Said the man who took them was a dangerous hermit living up on this mountain." The trapper finally looked up, his cheerful smile gone. His eyes were cold and hard. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, placing it on the table between them. It was a silver cufflink with a polished black stone set in the center. It was a perfect match to the one Samuel had found in Rose's pocket. "He said to give you this," the trapper said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "He said you'd know what it means." The trap hadn't been closing. It had already sprung. The enemy wasn't at the door. He was already inside. The air in the cabin crackled with tension. The friendly trapper, Elias, was no trapper at all. He was a scout, a spy, and he was sitting just a few feet away, a smug look on his face. Behind the bed, Samuel could hear the girl's sharp, indrawn breaths. "Walsh is a patient man," Elias said, his voice conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "But his patience has run out. He wants his property back. He's giving you one chance. Send the girls out at dawn. Do that, and he'll let you live. He might even let you keep a piece of the reward." Samuel's mind was a whirlwind. A dozen men. He was outgunned, outnumbered. The cabin was a death trap. But he looked at the cufflink on the table, a symbol of Walsh's vile transaction, and something inside him hardened into cold, unshakable resolve. He had run from the world for 5 years. He wasn't running anymore. "Get out," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet. Elias chuckled. "I don't think you understand the situation, old man. You're alone. You have no allies. By sunrise, this mountain will be crawling with men who are getting paid very well to get those girls back. You can't win." "I said," Samuel repeated, slowly rising to his feet, the rifle held loosely in his hands. "Get out." The scout's eyes flickered to the rifle, then back to Samuel's face. He saw something there that made his smug smile falter. He saw a man who had already lost everything, a man with nothing left to fear. "You're making a mistake," Elias said, standing up and backing toward the door. "No," Samuel said. "The mistake was Walsh's. He thought he could buy and sell people like cattle. He thought he could leave children to die in the snow. He took a step forward, and he thought this mountain was empty. He was wrong." Elias, seeing the cold fury in Samuel's eyes, decided not to press his luck. He fumbled with the door bar and scrambled out into the night, vanishing into the darkness. The moment the door was barred, Ruth was at his side. "What do we do? A dozen men." "We fight," Samuel said simply. The hours before dawn were a blur of frantic preparation. There was no more talk of running. They were a cornered animal, and their only option was to turn and bare their teeth. Samuel's years of military training, long dormant, came flooding back. He wasn't just a grieving woodsman anymore. He was a soldier preparing a defensive position. "Emma Rose," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear. "Take every bucket, every pot, and fill it with water from the well. Line them up against the back wall. When they tried to burn them out, they'd be ready." "Ruth," he said, handing her an old but reliable Navy Colt pistol he kept stored in his sea chest. "Do you know how to use this?" She shook her head, her eyes wide. "You're about to learn." He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to handle the kick. Her hands shook, but she listened, her expression grim and determined. He wasn't just arming a girl. He was forging a soldier. They barricaded the windows with the table and the heavy chest, leaving only small slits to fire through. They laid out all the ammunition they had. It wasn't much. A few dozen rounds for the rifle, maybe 20 for the pistol. It wouldn't be enough. As they worked, a strange calm settled over the cabin. The fear was still there, a cold knot in their stomachs. but it was overshadowed by a fierce, shared purpose. They were no longer four strangers thrown together by a storm. They were a single unit, a family forged in the crucible of fear. Just before the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, Samuel gathered the girls. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "When it starts, you stay down. You do exactly as I say. Ruth, you take the side window. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. Don't waste ammunition. Emma, you and Rose stay behind the bed. Your job is the most important. You reload the pistol for Ruth. Can you do that?" Emma, her face pale, but her eyes steady, nodded. "Yes, sir." The sun had not yet risen when the attack began. It didn't start with a shout or a gunshot. It started with a soft thump against the roof, and then another. Samuel peered through a crack in the shutters. He could see dark figures moving in the pre-dawn gloom, surrounding the cabin. Then he saw a flicker of orange. A torch. "They're trying to burn us out," he said, his voice grim. A voice slurred with whiskey but sharp with menace cut through the morning air. It was Walsh. "Hawkins, send out my girls. This is your last chance. This ain't your fight." Samuel raised his rifle, resting the barrel in the firing slit. He took a deep breath, aimed at a shadow moving near the woodpile, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar shattered the morning quiet. A man screamed and fell into the snow. "Seems like it is now," Samuel yelled back. The forest exploded with gunfire. The next hour was a chaotic hell of noise, smoke, and splintering wood. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin. One found the window, shattering the glass and sending shards flying across the room. Samuel was a machine. He fired, reloaded, and fired again, his movements precise and economical. He wasn't fighting with rage. He was fighting with a cold, clear purpose. Every shot was a message. This ground would be paid for in blood. Beside him, Ruth fired the heavy Colt, the recoil jarring her small frame. Her first few shots went wild, but then she found her rhythm. She wasn't just a scared girl anymore. She was a defender of her family, her face set in a determined scowl. Behind the bed, Emma and Rose worked as a team. As soon as Ruth fired, Emma would take the pistol, her small, nimble fingers quickly reloading the cylinder, while Rose watched, ready to pass the next handful of cartridges. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. For every man Samuel and Ruth pinned down, two more would move to a new position. The fire on the roof had caught, and smoke was beginning to seep through the ceiling, making their eyes water and their lungs burn. Then through the cacophony of the firefight, Samuel felt a searing, white-hot pain in his left shoulder. He was thrown back from the window, the rifle clattering to the floor. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his shirt. "Samuel!" Ruth cried out, turning from her post. "Stay at the window!" He roared, gritting his teeth against the pain. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and pressed it against the wound. His left arm was useless. He struggled back to his feet, grabbing the rifle with his good hand. It was over. He knew it. The smoke was getting thicker. He was wounded. Their ammunition was running low. Walsh's men were closing in for the final rush. He looked at the girls. Ruth, tears streaming down her smoke-stained face, but still aiming the pistol. Emma and Rose huddled together, coughing from the smoke, but not crying. They were so brave, braver than he had ever been. He had failed again. He had brought them here only to lead them to their deaths. Just as one of Walsh's men kicked at the door, trying to break it down, a new sound joined the battle. A single, booming rifle shot from a completely different direction. It wasn't one of Walsh's men. The report was too heavy, like a buffalo gun. One of the men at the door crumpled to the ground. Another shot rang out from the woods behind the attackers. Another of Walsh's men fell. "What in God's name?" Walsh screamed, his men scattering for cover, confused. Through the smoke, Samuel saw a figure step out from behind a thicket of aspen trees high up on the ridge. The figure was small and wiry, dressed in buckskins. It was too far to see clearly, but they raised their rifle and fired again with deadly accuracy. But it wasn't a man, it was a woman. Ruth gasped, squinting through the smoke. It's old Martha Henley, from town." Martha Henley, the crazy old woman who, according to town gossip, saw things that weren't there. It turned out Martha saw just fine, and she could shoot even better. Martha's impossible intervention threw Walsh's men into chaos. They were being fired upon from two directions, caught in a deadly crossfire. They had no idea who this new shooter was, or if she was alone. The surprise attack had broken their momentum, but she was just one woman. It wouldn't be enough to hold them off for long. The man at the door was replaced by two more, who began slamming a heavy log against it, using it as a battering ram. The wood groaned, splintering. The bar was about to give way. Samuel raised his rifle one-handed, ready to make his last stand. He glanced at the girls. This was it. And then a third sound entered the fray. A chorus of furious shouts and the thunder of a dozen more rifles, erupting from the trail leading down the mountain. It was Jonas Pritchard, the storekeeper, and he hadn't come alone. He was leading what looked like half the men in Millbrook, all armed with hunting rifles and a righteous fury. "Get him, boy!" Jonas roared, his voice carrying over the din of battle. The tables had turned completely. Walsh's hired guns, caught between the cabin, the crazy woman on the ridge, and a small army of angry townsmen, broke and ran. The disciplined attack devolved into a panicked rout. The fight was over in minutes. Some of the hired guns escaped into the forest. Others surrendered. A few lay still in the snow. Jonas kicked open the remains of the cabin door, his face grim. "Saw the smoke," he said, his eyes taking in the scene. The wounded Samuel, the smoke-filled room, the terrified but defiant girls. "Figured you could use a hand." Men poured into the cabin, putting out the fire on the roof, tending to Samuel's wound. Outside, they rounded up the prisoners, but two were missing, Walsh and the saloon owner, Garrett. "They slipped away in the confusion," one of the townsmen reported. "They won't get far," Jonas said. "Sheriff's on his way. Sent my boy for him an hour ago." He turned to Samuel, dabbing at his shoulder with a clean cloth. "There's more. After that fellow Walsh left town, something didn't sit right with me. I sent a telegraph to the marshal in the county he came from. Got a reply this morning." Jonas's eyes darkened. "Those girls' mother, Eleanor Walsh? She didn't die of a sickness, Samuel. The marshal in Missouri says she was poisoned. Walsh has been wanted for her murder for the last 6 months." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Emma let out a choked sob. "I knew it," she whispered. "I told Mama the tea he gave her tasted funny. He told me I was imagining things. They weren't just running from a life of servitude. They were witnesses. Walsh hadn't just been trying to retrieve his property. He'd been trying to silence the only people who could connect him to his wife's murder." Suddenly, a scream from outside. It was Rose. Samuel, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, staggered to the doorway. In the middle of the clearing, Marcus Walsh had Rose. He'd circled back, grabbing the little girl as she stepped outside for fresh air. He held a large hunting knife to her throat, his face a mask of crazed desperation. Garrett stood beside him, a pistol aimed at the townsman. "Everybody back off!" Walsh shrieked, his eyes wild. "Let us go, or the girl dies. I swear I'll do it." The clearing fell silent. The townsmen froze, their rifles useless. This was it, the final standoff. Walsh dragged Rose backward, toward the tree line, and the horses he had hidden there. Samuel stepped forward, out onto the porch, his own rifle left behind. He held up his one good hand, showing it was empty. "Let her go, Walsh," Samuel said, his voice calm and steady. "It's over." "It's not over till I say it is." Walsh spat, pressing the blade closer to Rose's neck. The little girl whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "You're right," Samuel said, taking another slow step forward. "It's not over. You can still make a choice. You can be the man who murdered his wife and killed a child. Or you can be something else." "Shut up!" Walsh screamed. "You don't know anything about me." "I know what it's like to lose a child," Samuel said, his voice cracking with a pain that was suddenly fresh again. He looked past Walsh, his gaze unfocused, as if he were seeing a ghost. "I held my own daughter as she died. I know that hell. It's a place you don't want to go, Walsh. Trust me." Walsh faltered. For just a second, Samuel's words had reached through his panic and rage. His grip on the knife loosened, just a fraction of an inch. It was the only opening they needed. It wasn't Samuel who acted. It was Ruth. She had slipped out of the cabin behind him, the heavy Navy Colt held in both hands to steady it. She didn't aim for Walsh. She aimed for the branch of a dead pine tree directly above his head, heavy with a load of wet, packed snow. She fired. The shot was deafening in the silence. The bullet struck the branch and the entire load of snow cascaded down, dumping directly onto Walsh and Garrett. In the split second of chaos, as Walsh sputtered, blinded by snow, Samuel charged. He slammed into Walsh with his good shoulder, sending him sprawling. Jonas and the other men tackled Garrett. Rose, freed, ran sobbing into Samuel's arms. It was over. For real this time. The sheriff arrived an hour later to take Walsh and his men away. Justice, it turned out, could sometimes find its way even to the top of a lonely mountain. As the sun climbed high in the sky, illuminating a scene of chaos and relief, Jonas came to Samuel. "They can't stay here, Samuel," he said gently, nodding toward the girls who were huddled together in a blanket. "The cabin's damaged. You're in no shape to care for them." Samuel's gut clenched. After all this, to lose them. "My wife's already making up beds for them in town," Jonas continued. "They'll be safe with us until you're healed. Then, well, then we'll figure it out." It was the sensible thing to do, the right thing, but the thought of the cabin being silent again was unbearable. Ruth must have seen the look on his face. She came over, her expression fierce and determined. "We'll be back," she said. It wasn't a question. "As soon as you're better, if you'll have us." "Someone needs to teach me to read the rest of my book," Rose added, her voice muffled from where she was clutching Samuel's leg. He looked down at these three girls who had shattered his solitude, who had forced him to feel again, who had nearly gotten him killed. And he felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He managed a rough, painful smile. "I suppose someone does." 2 months later, spring had come to the mountain. The snow had retreated, replaced by a carpet of green shoots and wildflowers. The cabin was repaired, stronger than before, thanks to the help of the men from town. Samuel's shoulder had healed, leaving behind a puckered, angry scar. But the silence had returned, and it was lonelier than ever. He was on the porch, watching the trail, when he heard it, the sound of laughter. Rose's laughter, echoing through the trees. And then they appeared. Ruth, Emma, and Rose walking up the trail, their faces bright in the spring sun. They wore new dresses, and their cheeks were fuller. They looked happy. "We're back!" Rose shouted, breaking into a run and launching herself into his arms. That evening, the cabin was filled with the sounds of life, the smell of Ruth's baking, the murmur of Emma's quiet humming, Rose's excited chatter. It felt right. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Ruth turned to him. "Jonas said the judge in town wants to see you. About us, about guardianship." The word hung in the air. Guardian, father. "You don't have to," she said quickly. "We can manage. We just wanted to—" She trailed off, struggling for the words. "To thank you." Samuel looked at the three of them. Ruth, so strong and fierce. Emma with her quiet wisdom. Rose with her boundless light. They weren't a burden. They weren't a responsibility. They were a gift. "I'll go see the judge tomorrow," he said. The next morning they all rode down to town together. Judge Harper, a stern man with surprisingly kind eyes, made it official. He signed the papers with a flourish and declared them a new family. On the ride home, the wagon was filled with a quiet, joyful peace. As their cabin came into view, smoke curling from the chimney, Ruth turned to him. "No regrets?" she asked softly. Samuel looked at his home. Their home. He looked at the three girls who had stumbled into his life and saved him from himself. He thought of the long, empty years behind him and the unknown, hopeful years ahead. He reached over and finally turned the photograph on the mantel to face the wall again. Not to hide it, but because he didn't need to look at the past anymore. His future was sitting right beside him. "No regret," he said. And for the first time in a very long time, he knew it was the truth. This story is a testament to the fact that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the people who show up when you need them most. What part of Samuel and the girl's journey touched your heart the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming your way.